Peter Dorman with a look at general equilibrium theory. This is a topic that's often left out of introductory classes in economics, but it's sort of an unfortunate thing because when you think about it, the properties of the entire economic system constitute the single most important question that you would want to ask about an economy, even though the answers are often difficult to figure out and to explain. Here we'll do our best. We'll begin with the idea of a market as a homeostatic device, where supply and demand, the initial situation in the market, give it an equilibrium setting, a certain level of production and kind of production and consumption, which is a sort of equilibrium, and the market could vary from that, but might return to it unless external factors cause it to shift in some way. This is not a perfect system, as we've seen. The setting could be wrong, but it does have the advantage of being predictable and relatively stable. However, when you consider the story that we told about markets, you have to bear in mind that every single part of the story was simply assumed. None of it was demonstrated from factual evidence or is logically necessary in a social system. All of them rest on assumptions. We assumed that there are supply and demand curves to begin with. We never prove that such curves have to exist, but we just assume they do. We assumed, very importantly, that they have only one point at which they cross. So there's only one equilibrium in a market situation. We assumed that if the market is out of equilibrium, the process that returns the market to equilibrium doesn't change the equilibrium. It doesn't change the setting. That's an assumption. We didn't look below the market at how individual choices add up to it. And we didn't look above the market at how individual parts of the economy interact through markets and elsewhere to create an entire system. We have to consider all of this in order to tell the story about homeostasis. General equilibrium theory is the branch of economics that systematically addresses questions like this. It looks at all aspects of markets simultaneously. It looks below the level of the market at the individual level, so it considers markets as groups of individuals, and it also looks above the level of an individual market at the systemic properties of an economy with many markets. There are, broadly speaking, two general methods that are used in general equilibrium theory. The primary one is a deductive method using math. It sees the market as a set of simultaneous equations where you might have, for instance, one equation per market, and then looks at the property of that system of equations using analytical methods from math. The second approach is more inductive. That's using simulation methods. So in this approach, you program individual agents with certain properties, and then you set them loose in a context, a virtual context, to interact with each other, sit back and observe how what kind of an economy they construct. Economists do this. It's the same thing, basically, that a lot of people do for recreation, play simulation games. Economists do it as a day job. Combining the results from both approaches, we can see, if we look at the drift of general equilibrium theory, that there have been really revolutionary results in recent decades. What is unfortunate is that those results have not been incorporated into applied work. There has been a tendency in the last half century for economists to move into what's called applied general equilibrium models, where an entire economy is modeled typically as a system of equations, and but simplified. So at a very aggregate level, you might have a market, let's say, for instance, in natural resources, and it would combine all natural resources, or a single labor market for all labor. The more common applied general equilibrium models have something like 70 to 100 equations in them. It's a huge simplification. This is the approach which is taken, for instance, by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for its economic modeling. And it's used in many other circumstances by central banks, by trade, people looking at potential effects of trade negotiators, and so on. Unfortunately, the insights of modern general equilibrium theory are typically not found in this applied work. And if they were, it would change radically the way economists approach these questions. One of the reasons, perhaps, is that general equilibrium theory is typically not taught to economists unless they specialize in that subject matter. I'm trying to break the mold here by including some themes from general equilibrium theory in a basic course on economics. Let's consider, in order, three basic questions raised by general equilibrium theory. The first is the adding up question. How do individual choices add up to some kind of collective or social choice? The second is, what happens if we consider the impact of real historical time in an economic model? You may recall that when we talked about economists looking at choice and exchange, that both of these were seen as occurring within an instant of time. So that time was not really modeled. It was not part of the model. And even the adjustment process, time was not really taken into account. It just sort of happens. But what happens if we introduce real historical time into economic models? And finally, the systemic properties. How do the different parts of the economy affect one another? And what does that mean for the story of homeostasis? Let's start with the adding up question. Here is what it's supposed to look like. Consider three individuals. We'll call them A, B, and C. We'll give them these letters. And so each of them has a demand curve, which you can see in the diagram on the left. The one with the least demand for the product in question is individual A. At price P star, individual A wants to purchase QA. B is a little more favorably oriented to this good. If the price is P star, B will purchase QB. And C, at that same price, would purchase QC. If these three people make up the entire market, the market demand curve is simply the horizontal sum of their individual demands. So at price P star, the market, quote unquote, which is to say A plus B plus C, well, they demand QA plus QB plus QC, and that sum gives you QM, the market demand. It's a pure adding up process, and the market demand curve can be traced by looking at the individual demands at any price and not just at P stars. You can imagine higher prices and lower prices go through the same operation, and that would be the way of constructing a market demand curve. The same process is supposed to work for supply curves. So you can imagine three different producers, A, B, and C. And just to make things interesting, I had B and C had their supply curves cross. At a given price, each of them decides how much to supply to the market, QA, QB, and QC, and the sum of those gives you the market supply, QM, for that price. And then as you allow the price to vary, you could move up or down the market supply curve. So the market is the result, intended result, or assumed result of an adding up process. But let's think a little bit more about adding up and how adding up works. Here's a story. Suppose you have some kind of a criminal case taking place, and you've got a jury that's going to be selected and adjudicate that case. The jury will have 12 members. 11 have already been selected, and there's one opening left for a juror. Now, suppose that the defense attorney knows that of the 11 already selected, 7 currently favor acquittal. We're not going to ask how they got that information. They might have spies or something like this, but they are pretty sure that there are 7 votes for acquittal currently in that jury pool. That's a majority, 7 for acquittal. So it really doesn't matter what the 12th juror thinks. If they're for acquittal or for conviction, there will still be a majority for acquittal. So it doesn't matter. So the defense attorney says, hey, you can have a pro-prosecution juror if you want. we'll let you take that person. So the prosecution picks, let's say, somebody for juror number 12, or is able to get a juror number 12 who's maybe more pro-prosecution. So they have the trial, and when the verdict is returned, it's a 12-to-1 verdict for conviction. And the defense attorney says, how could this be? There were 7 people for acquittal before I added that final juror. Well, the answer is the final juror persuaded the other jurors to change their mind. In other words, the attorney's mistake was to engage in an adding up process. But jurors are not simply added up. They interact with each other in the jury room, and one juror can potentially sway the others. So if we generalize from this, we can see that there's a general reason why an adding up process can fail. And that is that people can affect each other in the choices that they make. So what I demand, what I wish to purchase, may affect what you wish to purchase. And what one firm supplies may affect what others supply. There are many reasons why this could happen. One is conformism. People have a tendency to copy one another. It seems to be built into how we are hardwired as human beings. And conformism can lead to these sorts of interactions. Network effects are often important. So goods can become more valuable if other people use them. The software I use on my computer is more valuable if other people use the same software and I can communicate or exchange files. Similarly, it can be easier to produce a particular item or use a particular method to produce it. If other people are also using that method, it can bring the costs down. In addition, for firms, there are often strategic considerations. Firms observe what one another do and may change their own actions based on what makes strategic sense, given the behavior of other firms. So in general, we can say that society is not simply an adding up of individuals. It's an interaction between individuals. The implication of that for supply and demand curves is that they may not even exist. A supply curve, the logic of a supply curve, as we saw in the adding up story, was that you could take each individual in isolation, figure out what they want, and then add them up separately to come up with a market supply curve or a market demand curve. But if the adding up process fails in some way, if there are interactions between the choices that are supposedly being added up, there may not even be a supply or a demand curve. Even if they do exist, they may be unstable. They may jump around uncontrollably. So the adding up story is a big problem. A final point about adding up is that there can be multiple equilibria. If you have a lot of interaction between the different decision makers whose decisions are being added up, you can get in a market an equilibrium with high demand or with low demand. You can get one with high supply or low supply. You can have movement from one equilibrium to another, and as a result, you really want to monitor this. It's not like a thermostat where you can just walk away. It is like a thermostat where you could have multiple settings that could all be in the thermostat simultaneously, with internal mechanisms that could switch you from one setting to another. This means, in practical terms, that it's very important for economists to pay attention to social norms, to the connections that people have mentally, culturally, psychologically, sociologically with one another, because those interconnections play a big role in determining how markets will work, whether you will have supply and demand curves, whether they'll be stable, whether they'll have one equilibrium or more than one equilibrium. And similarly, expectations, which are also interactive, are important. What I expect is a function to some extent of what you expect. And so in that situation, we also have the interactions that can complicate tremendously supply and demand analysis. The second assumption, historical time. The analysis of supply and demand we gave earlier did not rely in any way on the movement of time, actual time through history. Everything was assumed to occur in a single moment, or if there was movement, like movement along a supply curve or along a demand curve, there was no time aspect to it that was given. We didn't say over the course of a few hours, a few weeks, a few years. Time was not a consideration. However, it should be obvious that if you have an adjustment process in a market, that takes time. So time should be a consideration. The interesting thing is that if people make mistakes, let's say, or if there's a force that leads to some kind of disequilibrium situation, people leave the equilibrium for one reason or another, the very fact of their being out of equilibrium and there needing to be an adjustment can cause the equilibrium to shift. Now, let's think about what that means for a moment and how important that is. In the standard supply and demand curve, it doesn't matter where you are initially. There's an equilibrium where the demand and supply curve cross. That's the equilibrium. Whether you start at one point, like A, with a low quantity and a high price, or at another point B with a somewhat higher quantity and a lower price, it really doesn't matter because the response to shortage and surplus will bring you back to that same equilibrium that's given in that diagram. That's the basis for everything we said about markets in terms of their being predictable, their homeostatic properties, and potentially even the desirability of them. But now let's tell a different story. Let's go back to the 1840s and think about the California gold rush. Initially, in the beginning of the 1840s, very few people of European descent and Anglo-speaking people, English-speaking people, lived in California. It was populated to the extent it was by native people and by Spanish-speaking people. In particular, people who lived along the relatively populous east coast of the United States had relatively little desire to make the arduous journey all across the continent to go to this new land of California. It didn't seem to offer them much. But then, in 1848, news emerged of a big gold find. There was gold in California. It was the Golden State. You could go to California, dip your pan in a river, and come out with enough gold to make you rich. So, for a lot of people, that was reason to brave the hardships of cross-continental travel, and they did. Well, they got there, and the story proved to be false. There was hardly any gold in California. Very few people made money from it. It was a big mistake. On the other hand, with all the new arrivals in California, there were new business opportunities. The gold miners needed to eat, they needed housing, they needed all sorts of things, and businesses arose to service them. With that, there was a shift, as you could say, in the equilibrium. And as a result, even more people started traveling from the East Coast to California in order to take advantage of those new business opportunities. In other words, the false news about gold in California, which was initially taking people out of a so-called equilibrium of self-interest, was based on a mistake. The false news changed the situation in California in historical time and created a new situation in which the desire of people as to where to live and where to travel had changed dramatically and with long-lasting consequences for California, North America, and all the people who live there. So let's generalize this and think about it in general equilibrium. So a market which is out of equilibrium is going to produce economic changes. So if the price is too high or too low, for instance, there are some people who are going to be making more money or less money. There are some producers who are going to be increasing their production or decreasing their production. And also, as we saw in California, there could be geographic changes of where consumption and production are taking place. These temporary situations may have permanent results by changing the initial equilibrium. So the market can be thought of as a thermostat which has the power to change its own setting. The name that general equilibrium theorists give for this result, which has been proved to a high degree of of precision and credibility is the Sonnenschein-Montel-Debreu theorem, named for three different economists, two of whom received Nobel Prizes for this work and other work. So how important is this? What does it mean? Well, this is really an interesting result the more you think about it, because what it says is that the path to a market, the path to an equilibrium, changes the equilibrium. This is the general concept of path dependence, which is a term used in different social sciences, also in economics. It means that history absolutely matters. You can't ignore the history of how you arrived at a situation in order to know what the equilibrium, if there is one, to that situation is, and how beneficial or non-beneficial it might be. The third question or set of assumption we'll look at is the issue of interaction effects, or how do the different parts of the economy all relate to each other. The homeostasis story we told about equilibrium was a story that emerged out of a single market. We had a supply curve, we had a demand curve, we had equilibrium in a single market. The curves were drawn or assumed to occupy some kind of space in that market based on what are called the ceteris paribus conditions for that. So all the things that are held constant, the incomes of people, their expectations, the behavior of others, and so on, the things that are held constant so that we can just look at the effect of price on choice. However, if we're looking at the entire economy as an interconnected mechanism, it's obvious that we have to drop this ceteris paribus assumption, because each sector in the economy that changes will affect the other sectors. There are going to be ripple effects or rebound effects operating within the economy. And that raises the question, well, is the system homeostatic at the system level? And if it's not, what does that mean about the individual parts? Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe the ceteris paribus assumption was simply wrong, and the analysis doesn't work. So to clarify this, let's consider two different situations. We'll start with a situation where homeostasis actually does work or could work. Let's suppose that we're talking about a market in fish. I'm not going to specify which particular type of fish. Assume that there's only one type of fish and one type of market for it, and also assume that it's in equilibrium. Now, suppose something happens out there in the world which is going to change the supply of fish, make fish more scarce. Initially, that's going to reflect itself in a movement out of equilibrium, because you have the initial expectations of people about supply and demand and an equilibrium price and quantity, and then suddenly the fish are more scarce and the price goes up. So what's going to happen? Are we going to have a homeostatic process? Well, consumers, of course, will buy less fish. If fish has become more expensive, they'll substitute other things. Let's imagine that they substitute tofu for fish. They really They don't like red meat or something like this. They prefer tofu as a substitute for fish. So this is where they'll now get their protein. The result of that is that soybean farmers who make the raw ingredient for tofu are going to experience more demand, and that's going to make the price of soybeans go up, and soybean farmers will be wealthier than they were before. And with that extra money, they'll spend more, and if they're rich enough, maybe they'll spend some of it on fish. Even though the price of fish has gone up, there may be more demand on the part of soybean farmers because their income has gone up even more. However, under normal circumstances, and economists with their analytical methods have specified pretty carefully what those are, under normal circumstances, the increase in demand that comes from the soybean farmers or the tofu processors will be very small relative to the initial shift in backwards in the demand for fish. And so that rebound effect will be smaller. That second round effect will be smaller than the first round effect. And you could trace it through the economy round after round. Of course, you get somewhat more demand from fish from soybean farmers, and maybe the price of fish will go up a little bit because of that. And then fish Fisher people will have some more money and they'll do something, maybe have more tofu or less tofu, whatever. You could work through the consequences of that, but it would normally be a convergent process, and it would lead to a new equilibrium with less fish in general and more tofu, sort of what you expected initially. This is the more favorable version of a general equilibrium story for market analysis. If this story were all there was to it, market analysis would be pretty good. I mean, it wouldn't be perfect if you isolate a single market, because there are these rebound effects, but the rebound effects would not fundamentally alter the conclusions you come to at the individual market level. Now, the reason that story works is because the only relationship between the fishers and the soybean farmers and the tofu processors and the consumers of all these goods was through the market. The only impacts that occurred were through changes in demand or supply in response to prices or incomes. However, if you have market ripples, which are not based on markets, rippling through the market that occurs because of other types of interactions, that convenient property no longer holds. Let's look at some stories where that might be the case. Story number one, let's consider the relationship between the price of oil, petroleum, travel, and location. So we begin with an equilibrium in the market for oil. It's at a certain price, and people are purchasing a certain amount of it. And then something happens that makes oil more expensive. Now, the initial first-round effect is that people want to drive less. And because they want to drive less, they look for new jobs that are closer to work. However, this will perhaps trigger a change in the location of jobs and also the location of services that cater to people based on where they live, so retail services and so on, schools. And these might all shift in response to the changing locations of workers. And that could, in turn, shift the demand curve for workers to purchase of oil, such that the whole demand curve now shifts to the left. In other words, even if the price of oil were to return to its original level, there would be a new and different demand for it. It's like the California gold rush story, in a sense. This would be a new equilibrium. Another story. Let's consider the change in a rural area that might be caused by the introduction of polluting industries into it. So we'll begin with a nice, clean, happy, healthy rural area, farming, recreation, people like it. Now, for whatever reason, a factory moves in, it begins to cause a lot of pollution, air pollution, water pollution. The air quality suffers, the water quality suffers, wildlife die off, and as a result, the land surrounding this factory becomes less desirable for the original uses of agriculture and recreation. So the people who depended on the land for those purposes and who care about the environment move. They leave. It's not good for them anymore. Once those people leave, the damage caused by pollution goes down because there are fewer people concerned about it. So more factories then come in, and there's less additional harm caused by their pollution. And in the end, what we end up with is a new equilibrium, which is dirty. It's lots of dirty factories that have all converged on an area and made it undesirable for any use other than these dirty factories. So what's the common thread to stories like this? It's non-market interaction. It's the interaction between the different parts of the story, the different individuals, the firms, the goods they were producing, with each other through mechanisms that are not about markets. They're not about buying or selling or income. They are operating in different ways. So for instance, in the location story, we had tendencies towards spatial clustering. Spatial clustering occurs when it makes sense for people to cluster their activities locally to each other because of the activities go well together. So service providers and schools and so on will tend to cluster with residences, also jobs. That's a spatial interaction. Part of that interaction occurs through markets, but part of it just occurs through people being closer together in a spatial sense. Similarly, with the factory story, we had an interaction between the factories via the environment. Pollution interacts in air and water and land, in addition to ways in which it might interact through markets. There's a physical environmental interaction. And furthermore, when people leave an area because it's become too polluted, that changes the cost of pollution. The additional cost becomes less because there are fewer people to experience it, but that's not operating through a market. That's simply a result, again, of an environmental interaction or non-interaction as people leave. Non-market interaction has very large effects in society. It creates multiple equilibria. The equilibrium that we tend to arrive at is the one which is closest to the one we were at in the past. In other words, there's a certain historical inertia that occurs in the economy that is the way in which actual economies move through multiple equilibria possibilities over time. Another reason why history matters. And very importantly, there can be tipping points between different equilibria so that a small change in one equilibrium situation can flip you into a new equilibrium situation. From the standpoint of the market as a social device for making social decisions, they are relatively useful as homeostatic mechanisms for adjusting around a given equilibrium. If we're in a particular situation, a market can be a useful mechanism for remaining in the vicinity of that situation and adapting more or less automatically to small perturbations or adjustments that need to be made around that equilibrium. However, markets have no mechanisms in them, none whatsoever, for choosing between equilibria. For that, we need some other type of social mechanism. So how common is it to have this type of non-market interaction? Well, it's quite common, and for a variety of reasons. As I mentioned before, environmental interactions between the kinds of production processes we engage in, the waste that we create, and the physical environment can cause all sorts of interactive effects outside the marketplace. Spatial interactions like clustering, another example. Different goods can interact with each other physically. One good can make another good more useful or less useful, increase its lifespan or decrease its lifespan, simply because of the physical interaction that occurs when they occupy related space. Health interactions. We all are physical or biological beings that inhabit an environment, and things that are good or bad for our health travel between us are the consequences of things that we do, and that is another non-market source of interaction. Culturally and psychologically, we interact with each other on an ongoing way. We have social norms, persuasion, herd effects, and so on, which cause us also to interact. To sum it up, we can just say that the reasons why society is more than the adding up of individuals are the same reasons why there are non-market interactions and multiple equilibria. So let's take a final look at general equilibrium theory and draw some conclusions from it. The first is that the supply and demand model is essentially a metaphor. It's a simplification of a very complex social reality, which draws attention to certain features, it foregrounds them at the expense of distracting us from other features. It works more or less for at least some individual markets considered in isolation. It doesn't work perfectly for anything, but it works maybe adequately for a number of individual markets. It absolutely does not work for the system as a whole. That's lesson number one. In particular, we would say, if we were looking again at the market welfare model, you recall the three conditions, that the supply curve represents marginal social cost, the demand curve represents marginal social benefit, and there's a single equilibrium where supply equals demand. It's that third condition that breaks down routinely in the market welfare model according to general equilibrium theory. That's an important lesson. Homeostasis, the tendency of the system to return to its original setting after a perturbation, works partly. It still somewhat works. We can see it in operation all the time, so it would be crazy to say that it totally breaks down, but it only works partly. The system does keep changing its setting as it adjusts. The setting is a moving target. It's not a fixed target. And we do have to be concerned for tipping points where the system can shift quickly and perhaps even irreversibly between two different equilibria based on relatively small changes that take place. Final thought I'd like to leave you with: does economic complexity now commit us to a system we need for homeostasis, but which prevents us from exercising control over the direction our economy is taking?